Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series. Today's topic, internal versus external, the great debate for exit interviews. So really appreciate everyone joining us. We're going to be about 45 minutes today, so we'll try and get through some information very quickly. I do invite you to use your chat button to ask questions along the way. Makes it a little bit more entertaining for everyone. And a couple of points, I'm actually going to ask for your participation and ask you to provide me some feedback. So if you can use that chat button to provide that feedback, that would be great. So again, my name is Danny Nelms. I'm the president at the Work Institute, and have been in human resources for over 20 years. So I've actually conducted many exit interviews myself while I was with companies in HR, but also with the Work Institute as a company that actually provides outsourcing of exit interviews, have overseen the work that we do here as well. So it's a very interesting topic for me, and one that I've done a lot of research on. Certainly I've tried to capture some of that in our PowerPoint, but as usual I'll be just providing some anecdotal information as well from both my experiences and from our experiences here at the Work Institute. So some key topics that we're going to, and I just noticed I've got a slide messed up here, I apologize, but we're going to talk about the impact of employee retention, the current practices in exit interviews, using your former employees as consultants, and then just talk a little bit about evidence-based employee retention. I apologize, I forgot to take a point out there. And then I will do my best to leave some time at the end for some Q&A, and again, we'll ask you to use your chat button to actually use for asking questions at the end. So, you know, I always like to start out anything related to exit interviews with just talking about the impact of employee retention. And employee retention, if it's not a hot topic in your organization, I expect that that is going to become a hot topic very, very soon. The national trends that we're seeing are a little scary. Turnover over the last 5 years is up 45%, and just looking at January of 2014 to January of 15, turnover is up about 11% year over year. And I just looked at the projected numbers for February that came out from the Bureau of Labor Statistics just this week, and there are just now over 5 million open jobs in the U.S. And if there are 5 million jobs open in the U.S., that means that there are so many companies out there that are clawing for talent, and there's a good chance that they're going to come knocking on your door, talking to your employees, trying to attract them to move and go to work for another company. And that's where obviously exit interviews become extraordinarily important, because we've got to be able to understand why people leave in order to build the appropriate retention strategy to try and keep them for the long term. So why should we even focus on employee retention? And the number one thing I think of is cost. It's just so expensive to lose employees. The research tells us that even an $8 an hour employee will cost us about $5,000 when they leave. And if there's one thing that I often see as I've talked to companies all across the U.S. is that larger companies tend to think about the cost a little bit more. Smaller companies don't always. And I think, again, this gets back to this internal versus external. I think that when companies are using an outsourced resource, that outsourced provider oftentimes is trying to justify themselves based on return on investment. And so they encourage the company to focus on that cost to turnover versus when it's done internally, there's not always as much focus on the cost of what the cost it is created when someone leaves. So, you know, I'm going to try and throw in some of those anecdotal pieces as we go along to kind of show the differences that we see when someone's doing exit interviews internally versus when they're doing them externally. Obviously, when someone leaves, there's just such a significant loss of company knowledge. You know, maybe not so much when we get those early tenure terms, those first 90 days, although I would say in some ways those are more costly from a recruitment standpoint. But certainly when we lose an employee that's been with us for 3, 5, 7, 10 years, there is always a significant loss of company knowledge. and it takes a long time to get their replacement up to speed on all the things that they know. There's often a disruption in customer service. One of the things that we see here in the Nashville area, because we have very low unemployment and there is high demand for talent, is that it causes at restaurants and places like that, people can find jobs readily, and you find that the service in a lot of places where those type of workers are at becomes disrupted because people are leaving. And especially in areas where you've got call centers, you may have big, long wait times, and sales is a significant sector that has high turnover, so that creates issues for prospective customers and customers. So there's just a huge disruption to customer service when we have turnover. Turnover often creates more turnover. It's just a chain effect. When people start to exit the organization, people worry that something's going on, that there are issues. They get the sense that maybe the grass is indeed greener on the other side, so it often creates more turnover. And of course that creates lost productivity. It takes a long time to get new employees up to speed, and so we just have this significant loss of productivity that doesn't always show up in our P&L, but we know it's there. We know that we're just not being as productive as we can. Turnover causes lower employee engagement. With the fact that we have over 5 million jobs open in the U.S., there's so many companies that have job openings, and it's creating unwanted stress on other employees. They're having to pick up the slack. They're having to work overtime. They're having to do jobs that they don't typically do, and so their engagement level is oftentimes affected because they're unhappy having to pick up the slack. And the fact that that can actually cause lower performance because they're having to do multiple jobs, they don't pay as close attention to the details, and the performance in their role is often affected. And this is just undue stress on the employees and on the organization. Just quickly a look at cost. I mean, some of the elements of turnover costs include that loss of productivity, the temporary replacement, hiring costs, training costs, administrative costs. All of those things add up. And I like to look at the real numbers because when you look at a typical company of maybe 500 employees, you've got 12% turnover, an average salary of $50,000. That cost of turnover can be somewhere around $1 million, and that's almost over $300,000 in direct cost. So in just a small company, you can see it's significant. And in a larger company where you've got 5,000 employees with 10% turnover, then you've got just $35,000 per employee on average with their salary. Then it's over $5.5 million in cost, with direct cost almost at $2 million. So turnover is expensive, and there is absolutely a reason why we need to look at retention. And exit interviews are an absolute critical component of building an effective retention strategy. Somebody, if you'll hold just 1 second, I've got a chat that somebody's looking for the dial-in information, so I'm going to give that to them. I apologize, somebody needed the passcode to get in. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the current practices in exit interviews. Back in December, through a partnership with a company here in Middle Tennessee called Business and Legal Resources, which has the subscription services around HR Hero, HR Online, and a number of other services, we actually conducted a survey to get feedback on the current exit interview practices that are going on throughout the U.S. We had over 1,600 companies reply related to this to the survey, and it was really a good mix of small and large companies. So it was really anywhere from 10 employees up to well over 25,000 employees were represented in the survey results. The first thing that we wanted to know was, does your organization conduct exit interviews with departing employees? And as you can see, almost 80% of companies actually do conduct some type of exit interview with their departing employees. So there's a very large number that are trying to conduct exit interviews on an ongoing basis. This is consistent with the data that I've seen in other surveys that have been conducted by others. So most companies out there do attempt to conduct some type of an exit interview. Why do companies actually conduct exit interviews? Well, the number one reason is to actually identify problem areas in the company. And I think that most of the time we think about exit interviews from the perspective of determining the reason for leaving, and that's certainly the high number 2 reason, but we can't forget that exit interviews provide us insight across a whole range of issues. And so we can look at it from a compliance perspective, certainly improving organizational performance, identifying supervisor issues, but really trying to identify overall problems in the organization is the primary reason why companies are conducting exit interviews. So, and it usually is seen that those problem areas are part of what is causing the turnover in our organization, and they may not be related specifically to something that we think of as affecting turnover, but things like, poor IT services, or we may have a poor facility. We may have issues environmentally. So there are a lot of problem areas that can come up that are either directly or indirectly affecting employee turnover. But of course, determining reasons for leaving is a big reason why companies are in fact conducting exit interviews. Do you currently conduct exit interviews internally, or do you have an outside third party conduct the exit interviews? Well, obviously that's the question that we're here to talk about today. And within this survey, actually 96% of the companies that responded said that they actually did them internally. Only a very small portion, less than 3% obviously, used an outside third party, and a few companies, a very few, were actually using both. I saw another survey on this subject that's about a year old, where they said that 87% of companies' HR was actually, or that the exit interviews were being done internally. So clearly, the vast majority of companies are in fact conducting their exit interviews internally. And of course, we're here today to look a little bit into that practice and see if that's a good practice, or if we should consider alternative ways. If internally, who currently conducts the exit interviews? Well, obviously the number one source is human resources. And having been in HR for many years, I certainly have conducted my share of exit interviews. So about 90% of the exit interviews that are done internally are actually conducted by human resources. And certainly if in fact exit interviews are going to be conducted inside, the research would tell us that this is the most effective person to potentially do it, and we'll get to a little bit more of that in a few minutes. But the second highest number is the employee's direct supervisor, and then we will find that that's not always the best person, because oftentimes the direct supervisor is part of the issue related to an employee leaving. When are exit interviews conducted? Well, about evenly split, with a little over 40%, is sometime during their notice period, so you can assume that that's typically around 2 weeks or so prior to their leaving, or on their last day of employment. Less than 10% are conducted after the employee has left. And so we're going to talk about that in a few minutes, because timing absolutely affects the authenticity of the information that employees are providing. What is the biggest challenge to effectively utilizing exit interview information? The number one issue is senior management buy-in. Do they trust the data? Do they believe that the data is important? Do they believe that it's accurate, is number one. Number two is a challenge with it being a consistent process. And when we talk to companies who are conducting exit interviews internally, this is often what we hear, is that it's just simply a difficult process. Many of the organizations that we work with are very geographically dispersed, so they have multi-locations, oftentimes in multi-states. And so trying to have a consistent exit interview process in that type of setting is very difficult. The other thing that I think is happening right now is I think HR is just being tasked with so many things that they have to do. And so we're trying to operate lean, we're trying to operate effectively, we're trying to operate efficiently, and sometimes the dollars just aren't there to staff at the level that we'd like to. So it's hard to consistently do the exit interviews when staffing is an issue within HR. So inside versus outside. So obviously I've tried to look at this as objectively as I could, and I've tried to go out and look at literally dozens and dozens of articles related to this subject, and trying to find what are those pros and cons for internal versus external. And what I find is that from an internal perspective, it's a little bit of a perception issue related to the company. And we'll talk more about that a little bit in terms of what the research says. But there's certainly a potential that you could retain an employee. If the interview is done during the notice period, the perception is that there's an opportunity to convince that employee that they should stay. Now, we could get into a very lengthy debate on whether we should provide counteroffers or whether we should convince somebody to stay that's already decided that they're going to leave. But certainly there is the perception out there that an exit interview can be used in order to encourage someone to stay in their job. And that maybe through that exit interview, you can learn some things that are issues in the organization that maybe should be corrected and can be corrected that would lead that employee to want to stay in their job. I think this is often true, or I don't know that often, but I certainly think it does occur. I mean, I've heard a number of individuals tell us that they've been able to convince the employee to stay. I think the interesting thing would be to see how long they stay after they make that decision. It's kind of the same argument about making counteroffers. If someone's decided they're going to leave, ultimately they typically leave within a year, even if we make a counteroffer. But certainly that is a reason why you would want to conduct an exit interview internally, is so that you hear firsthand why they're leaving, and then you can potentially make changes that would cause that employee to stay. Kind of related to this would be just the speed at which changes can be made. If the exit interviews are being done internally, and an issue is brought up in an exit interview and it's clear that the organization needs to make a change, then oftentimes that change can be made very quickly because it can be acted on immediately. So speed can sometimes have an effect. I think there's a perception that leaders have that they may trust the data more. This is not backed up by research, but we often hear, and as you saw in the survey results, getting leadership buy-in is still difficult sometimes for exit interviews. And I think that if you have a trusted HR advisor, then the senior leadership may trust that that HR person is getting the right data, the right information, and so they may trust the data more than they trust from an outside resource. So there may be some trust issues related to the leadership. It may be more cost effective. And we're going to talk a little more when we get to the external component about looking at those costs. But certainly for companies that don't have a lot of turnover, then it may be more cost effective to conduct exit interviews internally versus using an outside third party. We're going to look at a little bit of a formula to see how you should think about looking at the cost of conducting exit interviews internally. I think employees may perceive this as a high-touch approach. Certainly there are employees that look forward to talking to someone upon their departure. We will talk a little bit about the authenticity of the information gathered. There are certainly employees that will be 100% honest and they will give you very good feedback. It gives the company a chance to have closure with the employee, to tell them thank you for their service, to tell them you've appreciated the contributions that they've made. So there's a nice touch, if you will, that comes with a consistent exit interview process. I would argue that the same high touch can be achieved by doing an offboarding interview, whereby it's not intended to gather information about the company and about their job and about why they're leaving, but that there is an opportunity to talk to that employee about how much we appreciated their service, to tie up any loose ends around, final pay, commissions, bonuses, that type of thing, any company equipment that needs to be turned over. So I would encourage that there could be an offboarding process that provides that high touch that may not be an actual exit interview. And again, just the chance to make the exiting employee feel appreciated. So one of the things you'll notice here that, you do these things, you do exit interviews internally for a lot of reasons related to what I would call relationships. It's very relationship driven. It's very much the high-touch feel. There certainly are perceptions from leaders about the process that may lead to acting on the data more effectively. But from a research perspective, there's not enough research to show us that in fact doing the exit interviews internally versus externally is necessarily the best practice. What the research tells us about authenticity and really supports the idea that maybe the exit interview should be done externally is that there's two things that affect authenticity. The first one is timing. The research was conducted where an exit interview was actually conducted on the last day of employment, and then 2 weeks later, a second exit interview was conducted. And lo and behold, 40% of the reasons for leaving actually changed. Now, when I say changed, it's not that somebody necessarily said, well, in one case they were leaving because of the supervisor, and the other they said compensation. But what we saw, and what the researchers saw, that someone may just simply say, I'm leaving for personal reasons. But when they were asked 2 weeks later, they would expand on those personal reasons to include issues such as I was leaving because of my career aspirations, I was leaving because of my supervisor, maybe they were getting a higher paid job. So they will typically extend beyond just the surface reason why they leave to provide more details that are actually helpful in understanding how to develop a better retention strategy. And then the same thing was done on inside versus outside. So an exit interview was conducted with an internal human resource person on their last day of employment. And then about a month later, an exit interview was conducted by just an outside third-party consultant. And again, 40% of the reasons for leaving were different. Now, this is control group research. So in other words, this was done saying, here's a group that we do the same process with internally versus externally. We do the same process on the last day versus 2 weeks later. And the research showed that 40% of the reasons for leaving changed in both instances. So there is a lot of research that would point to the fact that doing exit interviews outside versus inside is on the whole going to provide more accurate information. Now, is that going to be the case every time? No, not necessarily, because only 40% of the reasons change. 60% of the reasons stayed the same. So it's not to say that if you're conducting an exit interview internally that you are always getting bad information. That is absolutely not the case. And certainly, depending, I think, on the skill level of the person that's conducting the exit interview internally, they may be more skilled at uncovering things and being able to probe for specific issues and may get more authentic responses. But I often tell people just to simply put yourself in the shoes of someone departing. You start thinking about, do I want to burn bridges? Do I actually want, to tell them about the things that my supervisor were doing that I didn't agree with? Do I want them to know that I'm going to work for a competitor? There's so many things that are emotional attachments to a job that we simply don't want to divulge all of the reasons why we left, and we don't want to give that up. The other component is just objectivity. You know, the grass always seems greener on the other side. You know, it's the old, you know, saying that we have all the time. And so, you know, we often see that employees will leave to go to work for maybe a similar job in another company, thinking that, you know, a number of issues are going to be better. But then as they've left and as they've gained some objectivity, they may be able to give more objective information about the company and what it was like to work there, because some of the emotion has now gone out of it. Leaving a job is, you know, in the top 5 list of stressful life events that exist. And so there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of emotion, especially for employees that have been in companies for a longer period of time. So being able to get away from the company, gain some objectivity is oftentimes very important in terms of providing exit interviews. So oftentimes when I'm talking to companies that still say they want to conduct the exit interviews using an internal resource, the one thing I do encourage them to do is to try and set up a process whereby they can conduct the exit interview at least 2 weeks after they've left. So rather than trying to conduct that exit interview on the last day of employment or during that notice period, set up a time in the offboarding interview to actually conduct an exit interview within 2 to 3 weeks after they've left. So this would actually remove one of the authenticity issues of having the timing issue. So I would encourage you, if you are going to do exit interviews internally, that you consider moving the timing from that notice period or from the last day to actually doing it via phone call 2 to 3 weeks after they've left. And I think that you're going to find that you're going to get more objectivity from your former employees and that you're going to get more authentic information. The other thing that we saw in the survey was this issue of consistency. And again, I go back to HR departments being staffed very lean, having very geographically dispersed organizations, schedules just being difficult to coordinate. So we oftentimes, if I could talk today, just get inconsistent processes and inconsistent interviews. If they're done by different groups, then one group is using one form, one group is using another form. There's just so many different things that impact whether we are actually getting a consistent exit interview process. I'm going to pause just a second. We have a question from the attendees. Do you think the delay will impact the participation in the exit interview? The answer is yes. It likely will affect the participation rate. What we at the Work Institute find is that overall our response rates are about 65%. And we often hear from companies, well, they get 100% response to their exit interviews because they're conducting them internally and they're conducting them on their last day, so everybody is getting an exit interview. And certainly I think that's not a bad thing. I think it's great that they're able to get 100% participation. The question is, are they still getting the best data that they possibly could? So there's absolutely going to be a lower response rate when the person has actually left and is gone for at least 2 weeks. Now we're going to talk in a couple of minutes about what are some things you can do to make sure that those response rates are as high as possible. So consistent interviews, I think, are important in any process. I mean, we talk about this even in the interview process, that having consistent interviews when we're trying to select an employee to come on board is so critical. Well, the same thing is true in an exit interview. If we're going to compare and contrast the data, we need to make sure that we're having a consistent interview conducted so that we can know that we can compare the data and we can look at it holistically and know that we can compare sort of apples to apples. And then, you know, it could be more cost effective to do exit interviews externally. I would just assume for a minute that we had an HR journalist that was making $50,000 a year. So if you look at that on an hourly basis, it's about $24 per hour. That's not, and I would think that it would typically take about an hour for an exit interview if it's done internally. If they're done externally, it's typically a little bit shorter, but maybe more impactful. And then you have to think about the additional time for the administration, putting information into some sort of reporting system, actually creating reports out of whatever tools that you're using. So anytime you're conducting exit interviews internally, if you're looking at inside versus outside, I would encourage you to think about the cost of someone conducting them. In fact, I just talked to a prospective client this morning who was talking about the fact that they simply were going to have to go out and hire a full-time employee to actually conduct all the exit interviews in order to make sure that they were all done. And that could obviously be a very expensive hire because you don't want someone who's potentially a $10 an hour employee who doesn't have the skill set, doesn't have the knowledge, is not a good behavioral interviewer to actually conduct exit interviews for your key talent that's leaving your organization. So, these are just some of the issues related to internal versus external. So if I had to sort of summarize it, I think when we think about doing them internally, it's very relational driven. I think HR has this desire and need to feel like they want to be involved in that process, that they want to talk to that employee, that they want to feel like they're getting firsthand information from that employee so that they can act on that information as quickly as possible. But it's very relationship driven. When I present information like this in speaking engagements across the country, inevitably I'll talk about, the differences of the 40% of reasons for leaving changes, and I get the response, well, but they tell me the truth. So we have this sort of idea that, we are bulletproof and that we can buck the system, that we can buck the trend, that we can buck the research, and that we're the one person that can interview someone and get to the truth. And certainly there are those people out there, and that is, it happens every day. But sort of the odds are against us. The statistics are there, the research is there that tells us that there are simply times where we're not going to be getting the best possible information inside versus outside. Just a couple of things that are being said. There was a Trillium Teams Inc., Joan Geddes, the best time to do an exit interview is anywhere from 1 month to up to a year after the person has left their position. This is because it gives the former employee time to gain more of an objective and less emotional perspective. So again, regardless of internal versus external, the timing is big, and I think that I know that doing them at least 2 weeks after they've left provides for that objectivity and provides for that ability to lessen the emotion in the process. According to Mr. Holtom of Georgetown University, the only real disadvantage to employers might be the cost. Nothing else makes the cons list. You have a higher probability of getting a trained interviewer. They can gather systematic data, and employees are more likely to be honest and cooperative. And this is talking about outsourcing them to a third party. So the only real disadvantage from his perspective in the research that he had done was the cost. And so again, I think we have to figure out how are we going to compare apples to apples on cost when we look at internal versus external. And I think, again, what we look at is, okay, if just a portion of a person's time is taken doing exit interviews, then it's not hard dollar cost to us. We're not having to write a check to an external third party to conduct the exit interview. It's just a part of their job, and we're paying them their salary. And that very well could be true, and certainly it doesn't show up in the P&L. But what other important tasks might we be taking them away from? So there's a lot to think about in terms of internal versus external. There are certainly, I think, more reasons why external makes sense, but I understand some of the arguments of doing them inside. I think that companies that are smaller with lower numbers of employees leaving are probably going to do them inside, and it makes sense to me. But certainly as companies get larger, more than 100 people a year leaving, I can imagine it's worth doing the cost analysis to see if in fact it can be done cheaper externally. And the research tells us that at the end of the day, the data is actually going to be more effective. So I want to just wind up by giving a few points on, what are some exit interview musts? Because again, I think sometimes we just look at the exit interview itself. And at the at the Work Institute, we really like to look at the entire process. What does the exit interview process need to look like? And so, the number one thing is, what is our goal? So do we have a retention issue? Do we have problems that we're trying to uncover? Are we just trying to give closure to an employee? Is it just an offboarding process that we want to make sure that we get, our equipment back? Is it a compliance issue? There can be so many reasons why we want to do exit interviews, and it's important to establish what is the goal. So depending on that goal might drive whether you want to do them internally versus externally. But it does mean that you need to identify a clear goal as to why you want to conduct an exit interview. The second thing that needs to happen is proper communication. So regardless of whether you're doing them internally or externally, you should give someone notice that there is going to be an exit interview. So if you're going to do them internally, then at least giving that person a couple of days heads up to let them know that you're going to be conducting an exit interview on their last day. Here's the time, here's the place, here's who's going to be conducting it, so that they have an opportunity to get their thoughts together. If you're going to be doing them externally, it's important in an offboarding process to identify the outside third party that's going to be conducting the exit interview, make sure they're aware, make sure you have their most current contact information, so that there's a higher likelihood that the exit interview can be completed by the external third party. That is one of the biggest issues related to not getting high response rates when you have an external third party, is simply not having the appropriate contact information. You need to make sure you're asking the right questions. And again, I get back to the consistency issue. Do we have a consistent questionnaire? Do we have a consistent way of asking it? One of the things that we didn't get into because it just didn't seem relevant in this session is, are we getting beyond just ratings? A lot of times we still see internal exit interviews are very survey-oriented. So you might be doing them internally, you might be doing them online, and it's just a survey. So if you ask the person how they would rate their supervisor, they rate them as poor, but we don't really know why. And that's why an interview is so much better, because you can actually ask somebody why they felt the way they did about the company, their supervisor. You can ask them about compliance issues. So there's a way to follow up and get the qualitative data to support the quantitative survey questions. So you have to make sure that you've got the right questions and that you make sure that you're being able to dig deep and get the actionable information. We need to make sure that we've got the right data and demographics. So, do we have information on these employees so that we can start to compare and contrast? So if we're looking at retention, if we're looking at turnover, do we see trends related to people that are leaving? Is it always people that have less than 1 year of service? Is 80% of our turnover happening in the first year versus 20% after they've been there for a year? So we need data to support that. Do we have issues with male versus female or Hispanic versus non-Hispanic? Do we have issues related to departments? Do we have issues related to job titles? So it's important that we have the right data and demographics to drive to our reporting and analysis. And so, again, a lot of times I see exit interviews that are done internally, and they take notes and they write everything on the interview sheet, and then that interview sheet goes in an employee file. And it's never actually shared with the organization in an organized way based on data and demographics. Again, research execution is just really about that consistency. Do we have a consistent way to conduct exit interviews? So if you're going to do them internally and you're going to do them with 1, 2, 12, 25 different people, there needs to be training. There needs to be consistency around how the exit interview is going to be conducted. What does the questionnaire look like? How are we going to approach it? No different than how we train on a behavioral interview when we're hiring people. We should have the same training for people that are going to be conducting exit interviews. And then it's important that we have detailed reporting and analysis. So again, exit interviews are typically done in order for us to understand issues that are going on in the company, problem areas, why people are leaving, And so we need to be able to report on that information. And again, this is different maybe for smaller companies that have 15 or 20 people a year leaving versus a large company of 10,000 employees that may have 2,000 people a year leaving, because we need to be able to look at the reporting and analysis and be able to get information out to the organization that compels them to want to make changes in order to improve the overall organizational condition. And then lastly is just meaningful action planning. So on a periodic basis, are we in fact taking action on the information that we're gathering? Do we have a consistent process? Do we have buy-in from our senior leadership team to make sure that we take actions consistently to make sure that it's, at the end of the day, that we're meeting our goal for exit interviews? And I'm going to buzz ahead. I actually kind of got ahead of myself a little bit. The last thing I wanted to touch on is just that one of the things that exit interviews do for us that people forget is that they act as a pulsing mechanism. Employee engagement has now risen to like the number 3 issue related to CEOs and HR in this country. And, I think it's great for HR because, employee engagement is often considered to be an HR or at least a human capital issue. I don't think it should be owned by HR, but I think the process is to try and measure engagement, to look at the issues related to engagement typically fall within HR. So there's a lot of visibility around employee engagement. And we know that team, manager, organization, and job drive employee engagement. Well, those same things drive employee retention. And so as we're using our exit interviews, it should act as a pulsing mechanism between that once a year, once every 2 years employee engagement study to see if, in fact, things are staying the same, to see if things are changing, to see what trends are going on. So in a sense, your employee engagement study may establish a baseline, for example, supervisor ratings, but how are those ratings over time as it relates to the exit interview? So it gives us an opportunity to get additional information throughout the year. One of my pet peeves is that employee engagement studies are just done once a year because, let's face it, in this day and time, things change daily, hourly, weekly. Things are not static. So things change routinely, and we have to make sure that we're have a pulsing mechanism in order to know what's going on in the organization. I think somehow, and I apologize, I think when I sent this to my colleague to load in the system, I think I sent the wrong one, so I apologize. I thought something was out of order. So that's my fault. So at this time, I'd like to open it up for Q&A, so you can use your chat button to actually ask me some questions, anything on your mind related to exit interviews, internal versus external. So we have a question from Ms. Rodriguez. Do you have a template to keep track of exit interview data? Well, I mean, from a template perspective, we are an outsourcer of exit interviews, so we don't really have a template per se that we would provide to an employer because we have a reporting system where we maintain all of that data. From a template perspective, I would suggest maybe Excel is the best place to keep the data in. At least that you can manipulate some information within Excel. If you've got some sophistication, an Access database may be able to be used. There are some companies out there that have exit interview software, so it may be able to use their software to actually conduct the exit interview and enter the responses into their tools so that you can actually use their reporting technology in order to get information out of the exit interview process. So we have another question here about online interviews. I didn't focus very much on online interviews. I was trying to keep the focus on external versus internal. But certainly online interviews are a pretty large slice of exit data that's going on. The challenge with online interviews is that they simply are just quantitative in nature most of the time. It's a survey. You're just getting a lot of quantitative responses. You're getting ratings, but you're not getting reasons. The same factors that influence the authenticity, whether it's online, affect them online on the last day of employment versus online 2 weeks later. So it's always best to do it later, at least 2 weeks after they've left. The problem with the online tools is the response rates go down substantially between the last day and the 2 weeks if you're trying to do an online exit interview. You know, if you're doing it online and you force a person to sit down and do the exit interview before they leave, then you may get 100%. Once they've left, you can't control that, and that's why a telephonic interview where you make it multiple attempts to reach them is the preferred method so that you can drive as high a response rate as possible. Are there other questions? Don't be shy. There's at least a few bold people out there. All right, well, we're about 3 minutes over our 5-minute time slot, so at this time I'd like to conclude our webinar. We appreciate you joining us today. Certainly if you have additional questions about internal versus external exit interviews, feel free to reach out to me, Danny Nelms, here at the Work Institute. Be more than happy to talk about it, talk about some best practices and how you can conduct exit interviews more effectively. Everyone have a great rest of the week. I appreciate you joining us. Join us next time for our next webinar series event here at the Work Institute. Have a great day.